Hey everybody, welcome back to Fix the Rust Bucket. We're going to do a short video here on how to replace your front rotors and your brake pads. Doing the brakes on the front of a vehicle, no matter what vehicle it is, they're pretty much close to the same thing. You're going to run into, the only thing different from what I'm showing you here in your vehicle could be the caliper bolts, the caliper bracket bolts, and just the size of the rotor and the brake pads will be slightly different. This is a 2000 Chevy. The slight difference is not going to change on how you actually replace your brake pads and rotor on this. So you have your brake caliper here, your brake caliper bracket here, your pads are underneath of your brake caliper on either side of your rotor. Now this rotor does not come with, some vehicles have set screws. It's a Phillips head screw in here. This one does not have it. If you do have that, just Phillips head screwdriver and you can back those out. If they're seized in there, if you can't back it out with the screwdriver, you can drill the heads out of them. If you have to end up drilling it out, it's not a big deal. They're not required to be in there for the braking system or your rotor. It just helps hold the rotor to your hub assembly on your vehicle. So with this truck, we have to remove our ABS wire from the brake line bracket. We'll remove the top and bottom bolt to our caliper, holding the caliper to the caliper bracket. And then behind that will be our caliper bracket bolts that we'll remove. And we can pull all this off and out of the way and get our rotor off and then put everything right back on. All right, so here we are with a rotor, our brake pads, and what tools we're going to need to complete the job on this truck. I just have standard, I guess they'd be like woodworking clamps. We'll show you later in the video. I use those to recess the caliper. I have a 1/2 inch breaker bar with a 1/2 inch ratchet, 18mm socket. That's going to remove your caliper bracket bolts. This here, there's the 3/8 ratchet with a T55 torque on it. That is for your the actual caliper to the brake caliper bracket. 10mm socket that goes to your brake line. Wire brush, it'll come in later, I'll show you. And the pliers just to remove the ABS line. Flathead screwdriver, and if needed, don't know yet, a pry bar to pull the caliper off the caliper bracket. Now let's get into the parts. So we are upgrading this truck to heavy duty. We have brake pads from Bendix. They're the severe heavy duty brake pads. I'll leave a link in the description for these parts that I have for this truck. And then also, now these rotors came from Advanced Auto Parts, I believe it was. They're CARQUEST brand. They're Frontline severe heavy duty brake rotors. They have a special coating on them from the standard rotor that you get. That's bare metal pretty much. Sometimes they're painted here like a non-rust, rust corrosion type paint. These are coated all the way around, all the way through, to not only help with less corrosion but dissipate heat. Now with these rotors, there's a special break-in process that you have to do. I'm not going to go over in the brake pad breaking in process. If you were to buy these, this paperwork comes with these rotors and it explains to you how you have to break them in correctly. All right, so before you do any brake job on any of your vehicles, come to your master cylinder underneath of the hood here. Take your cap, loosen your cap. Don't take it off and remove it because you don't want debris falling into your brake fluid. Just leave it loose sitting on there, and that way when you put the pressure on your calipers, squeezing them back together, the fluid can come back up into the master cylinder here. So we're going to start with pulling the ABS wire off of the brake line bracket here. Basically just going to undo the clamp and push it out. Just to get it out of our way. That's just to get it out of our way, so when we pull the caliper off, we can bring the caliper up here on top of the upper control arm and just set it down out of our way. We'll get our 10mm socket. Remove that bolt. Now that's loose. Now we can get into removing the caliper bolts, which is one up here, one down there. Like I said, most cars are all going to be the same, just different types of bolts. This requires a T55 torque to remove the slider bolts on the caliper. Remove them. They're out of the way. Put them off to the side. We're going to be cleaning them up and re-greasing those. Take your caliper. This is where you might need a pry bar. You don't. Sometimes they get hung up with older brakes, rust, dirt, grime, whatever. Take and pull it off without damaging your brake line or pinching your brake line. Just set your caliper up out of the way. Ours up there on the upper control arm out of the way. Now that exposes our brake pads and the brake caliper bracket. So there's one pad. Save one pad because we're going to use that pad to push the caliper pistons back in. Pull your other pad out. Yes, they were still good. They still had actually a lot of life on them. They weren't even halfway through, but we're upgrading to a heavier duty brake pad. With those removed, we now have our brake caliper bracket to remove. On this truck, it's an 18 millimeter bolt here on the top and an 18 millimeter bolt down here on the bottom. So these bolts might seem like they're coming off, a little bit hard. They have thread lock on them. I thread lock all of my bolts for my brakes back on when I set them on. Even though there's a torque setting, I also use thread lock. This one's loose. Just going to hold on to our brake caliper bracket so it doesn't drop. That to the side. I'm going to pull this off. We're going to clean this up. I'm going to show you how to clean this up correctly and how to reset everything to go back on the car. So with your brake caliper and caliper bracket out of the way, earlier I said if you had a set screw in here, you have to remove that set screw. It will be somewhere in here. If not, don't worry about it. This one doesn't have it. So to replace your rotor, slide it off your studs. Take your new rotor and place it on the studs on your hub. That's it. So with our new rotor on, ready to go, we're going to get our brake caliper down here. We're going to get our brake caliper ready to go back together. So what we're going to do here is right here on the, there you go. So the whole caliper, and then you have two pistons on this truck. Some cars have one. And now we're just going to take the old brake pad, set it down inside there, use that as our cushion between the piston and our clamp to not damage the pistons. So I have two clamps for this because of the two pistons. I want to evenly push them back in. And set the one clamp over to one piston, again on that brake pad. Same thing with the other one. Over the brake pad and on the back side of your piston. And then just start tightening them up. Just starting to tighten the clamps up little by little on each one. And what it's going to do is going to push these pistons, well, they're going back pretty quick. It's going to push these pistons back in flush with the back of your caliper, and that's what you need for the new pads. For the new pad itself, thicker, you know, it's thicker than the old ones. You need all that space. You'll feel them bottom out. You won't be able to tighten the clamp anymore. Both of mine are bottomed out, so they're pushed in as far as they're going to go into the chamber here where the piston sits inside. So go ahead and release the clamps. Discard the old brake pad and set the brake caliper back up on the control arm. Now your brake caliper is ready to go. If you are doing your brakes, inside here around your piston on your caliper is a rubber seal, a rubber boot. Inspect those, make sure there's no cracks. You can see this one's filthy dirty and it's got some rust on it. The surface rust is okay. That's not any damage. Look for any wet spots. That would indicate that your brake fluid is leaking out of your pistons. This is bone dry. The rubber itself, the rubber on the seals is still in good shape, very pliable. So for now, I'm okay with that. That's going to be fine. That's not going to cause any issues. So we have our new rotor on and also our brake caliper. The pistons have been pressed back in, set, ready to go for us to reassemble everything. We have a few more things to do. Here's all the old stuff, caliper bracket, and here's some of the new stuff and our brake pads. We're gonna have to, if you don't have a wire wheel, take a wire brush. That's where your wire brush is gonna come in handy. Take the wire brush and run through all these threads, getting a thread lock, dirt, grime, or anything else off of them. They don't have to be spotless, clean, looking brand new. You want all of those threads cleaned off so it'll thread back in correctly, and you can also set with new thread lock on there, locking that up. Same thing with the caliper slide bolts. We're going to go ahead and clean all that grease off, clean up these threads. But before we get into that, your brake caliper bracket has these metal bands on them, one on either side, one there and one on that side. Every front brake pad set comes with the new ones. Don't skip this part. This part it's very important. These allow your brake pads. You see the notch on there. So the notch and that flat surface right there runs alongside. The flat surface hits these 2 points here, and that notch runs alongside there. So as you step on your brakes, the pads are being pushed in, and then when you release your brake pedal, they come out just a little bit. They come off of that brake rotor, allowing the rotor to spin freely. If these get crudted or you don't replace them and re-grease the new ones, you run the risk of when you push on your brake pedal, you push in your brake pads. When you release your brakes, they don't want to slide back out. So what they're going to do is your rotor's in the middle here. Your brake pad goes up against the rotor, and because they're not greased correctly or done correctly, it doesn't come back off that rotor, and it'll start burning up the pad, wearing the pad down prematurely, and or heating up your rotor and warping your rotor. So this is an important step. Don't skip it. Screwdriver, sometimes you can take these off with your hands. The metals, I don't want to say it's sharp, but there is the risk of cutting yourself. So if you don't want to worry about that, just take a screwdriver underneath of them. It's that simple. They pop right off. Same thing on the other side. Just underneath of it. Lift up, push down, whatever you got to do. Twist it and it'll pop off. Now see, this one here is getting hung up a little bit on that end. Just go underneath. Break that one off as well. Now before you put your new ones on there, a little bit of work to do on the caliper bracket. Now we just got done redoing the suspension on this truck, so this was completely cleaned up and repainted. The rust is gone, all the surface rust is gone. But if you have surface rust or filth and dirt here, Just a little wire brush, scrape it off, clean it up best you can. I mean, if you want to clean the whole thing and then put some new paint on it, I guess. You don't have to. Clean that all off so there's no debris or any groove, you know, anything in the grooves there. Your new ones, you don't have to do anything underneath. They sit dry on the brake caliper bracket. Take and press them back over right there. Take and press them back over on top. Push these ends down, and that's back in place. You see there? That one's back in place, ready to go. Same thing on the other side. Press it down. They don't really snap in place, but they do lock in place. Bent the tab a little bit, but that's okay. Just push it out. Again, push them down, push there down. They're flush against the metal. They're ready to go. Now, before we go and put everything back together, we're gonna grease them up. But right now, I'm gonna clean up the bolts for the caliper bracket and also our slide bolts for our caliper. All right, so now we have our bolts cleaned up, our slide bolts and our caliper bracket bolts cleaned up. We've already installed the new metal clips onto the bracket. Every kit's gonna come with, or excuse me, not kit, but every brake pad, front brake pad set's gonna come with a little packet of grease. If it doesn't, you can just go out and buy another packet of grease. This grease we're gonna use on these metal clips. Doesn't take much to get on there and properly lubricate. Stick a little bit across there, on here, same thing on this side. Just take my glove. It's just easier with the glove, so you can just throw the glove, pull the glove off and throw it out and continue on with your brakes instead of having to wipe your hands down. Just smear that grease anywhere that brake pad's gonna run. One side done, hit the other side. Both of them greased. They're ready to go. Stick that back over next to the wheel. So for my slide bolts, I just use a high temperature grease. The brakes heat up quite a bit using them, you know, on and off. So I'd rather have something that's a little bit more reliable inside there. And I just dip it in there. It doesn't take, again, it doesn't take much. It doesn't take much on there. Just dip it in a tube. And just smear it all over the place. I do avoid as much as possible getting it on the threads because I don't want the thread being greased up. You have to clean them off or wipe them off. But both of them greased up. Keep them on something clean so you don't get any dirt or grime in there. And now we can move back to reinstalling the brakes. So now we have all of our parts ready to go. Caliper set ready to go. New rotors on the vehicle. Just going to replace everything back in this reverse order of what we took off. All right, so now we have everything cleaned up, greased, and ready to go. I did not mention, I want to point out, same thing on the pistons of the caliper. You want to check those rubber seals and boots, make sure they're clean. You want to do the same thing here on your brake caliper bracket. The slide bolt boots, you just want to make sure that they look good. They're not cracked, dry rotted, or anything like that. If they are, you're going to have to replace them. These are in good shape. So we're ready to reinstall everything, put our brakes back together. Everything's just in reverse. So you might have to push your rotor if you don't have a set screw on here. You might have to push your rotor on. Be careful not to get the grease from these parts that you've greased up on the surface of where your brake pads hit the rotor. If you do, just get some brake clean and clean it off, because if you get the grease on there, it's going to cause your brakes to basically slip and not grip the rotor correctly. So sometimes you got to push your rotor back on to get your caliper bracket back on there. We'll set this one back in place. Be careful to not try and get any grease on there. And we're just going to set the top bolt in just loose to start with, because I do want to put thread lock on them. Just hold that in place. Now we're going to go to the bottom bolt, put our thread lock, blue thread lock on. Put that on. We'll tighten up the bottom one. Just snug it up with your fingers. Go back to the top one, remove it. And we'll put the thread lock on that one as well. Now, if you do this yourself, you know this is going to be done correctly. I'm not saying garages don't do it correctly, but they might not take the steps that you can take at home to do the job correctly. Let's say maybe cleaning the bolts up or not. I don't know, and I'm not going to badmouth any garages. The ones I've worked in, we took care of the customers like it was our own cars. So with that thread lock on there and leaking all over me, thread that one back in. We're going to snug them up with our ratchet and then get our torque wrench. For the torque specs, each vehicle is going to be different, so look up your vehicle's torque specs. Mine are not going to be the same as your vehicle. Then we'll snug these up. Get my torque wrench out and we'll torque those down. So with the torque wrench, torque those bolts down. That's going to ensure that they're set correctly, the thread lock and torque, and they're not going to back out. So those are set in place. Next on this is going to be our brake pads to go back in. Now on this truck, well, every vehicle's going to have these. This truck's slightly different. If you see on this brake pad, there's two warning tabs. One there, one there. The other brake pad has one warning tab. This is a 2000 Chevy. On the Chevy Silverado 2000, the one warning tab actually goes on the inside because the top of the brake caliper bracket would be in the way of the other warning tab. You might ask what the warning tabs are. They're exactly what they say they are. They're warning tabs. So if you see, they're just offset about just under 1/8 of an inch. So when you wear your pad down and they start reaching these warning tabs are going to screech or scratch across your rotor, giving you that noise of like the brakes wearing down. It doesn't damage your rotor at all. But what it does is it saves these rivets on the back side here. Now these two rivets are holding this noise plate on here, but there's rivets holding this pad to this metal backing. Those tabs keep you from running down too low and those rivets being exposed, putting grooves and destroying your rotors. That's what those are. So when you start hearing your brakes making noise, more than likely it's these tabs. You can get away with just replacing, and I'll go over this at the end of the video too, you can get away with just replacing the pads if you get it done at the correct time. Anyway, let's get back to this. So this one, 2 tabs goes on the outside, 1 tab goes on the inside. Slip it over those grooves, slip them over where the grease is at. You might have to struggle, I don't say struggle, but you might fight a little bit to get them in there because these metal tabs might have to get pushed down a little bit more. But that one there, again, I had to push the rotor in. I really wish this truck came with set screws on these because it makes it so much easier, but it doesn't. With that push, now it's in place, top and bottom. Pull on the pad so it's up against your rotor. The rotor's going to move, but it helps when you go to set your caliper back in. Same thing with this side. These you tilt in. Again, be careful not to get grease on the pads or the rotor. Get that down in there. Again, set the grooves. Set the grooves on. And we'll put the back one back on again. That'll stop once we get the caliper sitting over top of these. Now with those in place and the rotor held up against here, you can, I guess, here we go. Here's a trick I could show you. So if you don't have a set screw, I should have done this earlier with you. Take one of your lug nuts, just put it on there snug. Just snug it up. That's going to hold just like a set screw. That's holding your rotor in place now. It's not going to go anywhere. And I should have done that in the beginning, and I didn't. I don't know why. So now we can make sure these are set in place correctly. Squeeze them against the rotor. Now we're going to bring our caliper down. When we bring our caliper down, we have to push these in with our fingers and slide the caliper on the boot or around the boot. We don't want the boot to get pushed sideways or pinched because then your bolt's not going to slide into that correctly. So it's just a little dance you got to do with those, but it's not anything hard. Now, bring your caliper back down, slip it over. It doesn't matter if you go top first, bottom first. We'll go to the bottom here first. We're going to slide over the brake pads. Now down here you can see, push the boot in with your finger and drop the caliper down over the boot. Same thing on the top. Push in here on your rubber boot, slide the caliper over, making sure that that's right. It's going to sit in there loose because your caliper has been compressed and it's not tight on the brake pads, but that's okay. We're going to do that at the end. Take your greased slide bolts, put them in. Just snug that one up just a little bit. I'm not going to put that one all in, and I don't want to pull it back out either. They thread into the caliper itself and then slide inside the caliper bracket. That one in place. Put the bottom one in place. You might have to wiggle them just a little bit to get it to seat. I don't know if you can see this one because the brake line's in the way. We'll get this one wiggled in. And now what we'll do is, with them in place, this is different than what we just did with the caliper bracket bolts. I'm just going to put a little bit of thread lock across the top, let it drip down underneath. Same thing with the bottom. That thread lock is going to lock that bolt inside here on the caliper. So with that, we tighten these up. Again, check your own vehicle's specifications for any torques. So with those tightened down, that completes doing a brake job on the front of your car. A new rotor and new pads. We can take the lug nut back off. The rotor's not going anywhere now. We have to put on this vehicle, we have to put the brake line bracket back on, which this one here is just a little metal tab that sits in a hole. And then this 10mm bolt that holds it to the knuckle. Just snug that up. It's in place. Put our ABS line back on. And that is it. That completes the entire brake job. We'll go to the other side, knock the other side out. So with your brakes done, everything back together, don't forget, come back here underneath of the hood, take your master cylinder cap, tighten that back up, and then we'll go into the truck and we'll set our brake back in. Basically, like I was saying earlier in the video, we're going to push the brakes, expanding the brake calipers back out. So with the vehicle running, just 2 or 3 times, just easily push on. It's going to be super soft in the beginning. Don't push it all the way to the floor. 2 or 3 times, and your brake pedal is going to get hard again. And there you go. Now the brakes are done. Everybody, so that wraps up doing front brakes on a vehicle. Like I said throughout the video, your nuts and bolts to your calipers and caliper brackets might be slightly different, but it's essentially the same thing on all vehicles. 2 bolts to the caliper, 2 bolts to the caliper bracket, rotors, went over to rotors. It used to be for every 2 times you replaced your front pads, you would replace your rears. So the first, if you have new brakes all the way around, fronts go, you replace those pads. Now when you go to get your second set of pads done on the front of your vehicle, you do your fronts and rears. Reason being is all vehicles do, the fronts do 75% braking and the rears only do 25% braking. And that's why the rears don't wear down as fast as the fronts do. So with that in mind, maybe you only have to do the fronts, but you can go all the way around if you'd like to. If you're doing it yourself, sometimes I do brakes all the way around, but I usually stick to that rule of thumb of for every 2 fronts, the rears get done. If you like this kind of content, subscribe right here. And while you're waiting for the next video, check out some of my other videos.